can, like I said, put your question in chat. That's a good way to put into the pipeline. We'll keep an eye on that. So that's the plan. For those who might be new, I am Chuck Ogg, and I'm with the Rock County Progressives. And our mission, as it will, is to promote education and activism here in Rock County. And we are a nonpartisan organization, although we do at times have politicians, just because they're knowledgeable, and we also like to educate them as to what we think is important. So we have our monthly meetings every second Wednesday, so keep that in mind. Most of you probably are on the list and know that already, but just in case. So I'm particularly excited to welcome our speaker tonight. In some ways, Mike is the reason the Rock County Progressives even exist, because it was, God, how many years ago? 10, 12, I've lost track. We were despairing, we had one meeting and 10 people came. Could we get people to come to the co-op? And so we invited Mike to speak, and lo and behold, 30 people came in. I remember my mouth just dropping, and I was like, wow, there's people out there with the right speaker, they will come. And so we learned a valuable lesson, and of course enjoyed Mike as a speaker, and we've had him back since then. And his career has changed over time. He is currently the executive director of Our Wisconsin Revolution, as they put it, an independent social justice organization working to make both our economy and our government a true democracy of, by, and for the people. And you can find them at ourwisconsinrev.com. And I think Mike put up a few links in the chat if you want to take a look at some related stuff. And that, I believe it's fair to say, that organization grew out of the Bernie Sanders campaign and has taken a life of its own, which I think has sort of helped to promote progressive candidates around the state and also raise issues. He's going to speak tonight on the state budget process, which I think is really important because it's the one place where the governor can really make an imprint and can hopefully put priorities, the kind of priorities we haven't seen in Wisconsin very much after the gerrymandering. And I think, like him, we hope that the governor will stand up to the legislature, and we need to see something different. So that's what he's going to be talking about. I gather they're going to be held next month, and this is sort of to get us ready for that. Mike was a former director of Blue Jeans Nation and former executive director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, which was what he was doing when he first spoke to the progressives, all about getting money out of politics, which is, of course, a huge issue that continues to plague us. And I didn't get too much of his personal background, but for those of you who came a little later, we've learned that he has a history of his family being here in Rock County, so he has a direct connection to this area. And so we welcome him back. And at this point, I usually say, give a big hand for our speaker. Yay. Welcome, Mike.
A virtual hand, yeah. Thank you, Chuck. Your guess is as good as mine. When I first came and spoke to Rock County Progressives, it probably is 10 years ago or more, but I don't know the year for sure. But thanks for having me back, and hello everybody. It's good to be with you tonight. Thanks for jumping on this call. I wish we could be meeting there in your regular meeting spot in person. That's way better. But here we are, making do with Zoom meetings left and right. And if you're anything like me, you're on too many of these things. But I appreciate you being willing to do one more today. It's important to focus in on the state budget, because when you've got divided government, as we do in Wisconsin right now, Republicans in the legislature can pass legislation and the governor can veto it. The governor can propose legislation and the legislature can refuse to act on it. And really on so many issues, it's just stalemate and there's nothing that gets done. But the state budget is the one bill that really has to pass every session. And so, that's a place where some action can actually occur, even when you've got gridlock on so many issues. And Wisconsin also is a state that has a governor with substantial veto powers when it comes to budget legislation. And so, as Chuck said, the legislature can pass a budget, but the governor has significant authority to reshape that budget. He not only starts the process by making a proposal, but he also at the end of the process has an ability to reshape the budget substantially through the use of his veto authority. And so that creates a dynamic, even with divided government, where some stuff can get done, where some steps can actually be taken for the benefit of our state. So if you're going to focus in on anything this legislative session, you really should be zeroed in on the budget. And then after the budget is put to bed, of course, the redistricting issue is going to be huge. And so I assume you'll be looking at the redistricting process in future meetings, and I certainly encourage you to keep an eye on that later in the year. But that won't come until after they've got the budget signed, sealed, and delivered. So with that, let me just say a few words about where we are right now as far as the development of the state budget. The governor put forward a proposal, a $91 billion budget plan for the coming 2 years. We have a 2-year budget cycle in Wisconsin. And the legislature has been holding hearings, and very soon the Joint Finance Committee will start its deliberations and actually marking up a budget bill. And that process takes weeks and weeks and weeks before it goes to the full Assembly and full Senate for votes. In theory, the budget is supposed to be done by the end of June. It often isn't done quite by the end of June. It sometimes spills over a little bit. Sometimes has gone as late as September or October. So that'll give you a sense of how long you've got to be in the ear of state legislators and to try to do as much as you can to steer this state budget in a good direction. When I think about the backdrop against which this budget is being developed, really, our state lawmakers are crafting this budget at a time when our state and our country are facing at least 4 intersecting crises. We are in the midst of 4 national emergencies, and those emergencies aren't unique to Wisconsin. They are national crises, but they have huge impact on our lives right here in our state. And to some extent, these are also global emergencies. So it isn't even something that is unique to the U.S. One of those emergencies, of course, is economic inequality. We have grotesque levels of economic inequality, and it is a worsening condition, and it has been made significantly worse by the pandemic. We already had extraordinary levels of income and wealth inequality in this state and in this country before the pandemic hit. But then, of course, once the pandemic hit, the nation's billionaires have become cumulatively over $1 trillion richer, while tens of millions of Americans have fallen below the poverty line. And so the pandemic has had an effect of worsening this condition significantly. On top of economic inequality, as if that's not enough, we of course have health insecurity. And that too is something that was a major crisis before the pandemic hit, but now being in the midst of a public health emergency, health insecurity has been made significantly worse. And that is an important theme for the state budget, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So then, along with economic inequality and health insecurity, you of course have growing and very chronic social and racial injustice. And a major dimension of that social and racial injustice is the fact that Wisconsin is a state that incarcerates huge numbers of people, mostly people of color. In fact, Wisconsin boasts the single zip code that is the most heavily incarcerated zip code anywhere in America. So we have a growing prison population that has gotten to the point where we actually spend more of the state budget in Wisconsin goes to pay for prisons than for the entire university system, which I think is one of the central tragedies of our state. And let me just repeat that. More of our state budget goes to pay for prisons than for the university system. And that's been a condition that has been with us a few years now, as the prison population has grown and more prisons are built. We haven't built a new university campus since the 1960s. And yet, since that last university campus was built, something like 8 or 9 different prisons have been built, and we've actually also exported some prisoners to other states and paid to incarcerate them elsewhere. So that's a huge part of the challenge that we have in Wisconsin, is that we're quite literally paying more for failure than we are investing in success. You know, when people mess up, when they commit crimes, we're paying an immense cost to deal with those errors, and we're not investing enough in human potential. And that is a central theme that I think we all have to encounter. So we've got economic inequality, we've got health insecurity, we've got this social and racial injustice that also has been made clearly worse by the pandemic, right? Because when you think about who has been hardest hit by the pandemic, it is unquestionably true that Black and brown people have been more severely impacted by the COVID crisis than white populations. And so even social and racial injustice has been aggravated in this last year by the pandemic. And then finally, of course, the fourth crisis that I'll talk about, and all of these crises intersect. The fourth crisis I'll talk about is environmental insanity, and particularly climate calamity. So here a budget is being put together for the next 2 years against the backdrop of those 4 intersecting crises that we've got to come to terms with as a state. Now, before the governor made his budget proposal, this goes all the way back to the latter part of 2020, we started communicating with the governor, urging him to include some things in his budget. And I did put a link in the chat to a document that's called Match the Budget to the Moment. And it outlines 6 priorities that we emphasized to the governor. One was boosting wages to help deal with that economic inequality, and particularly raising the state's minimum wage. The second was rewarding work by dealing with and here's something I really want to draw a line under, our tax system. We currently tax unearned income like capital gains or inheritances at a higher rate than we tax earned wages. So if when you're out there working for a living and earning a paycheck, you are actually paying a higher rate on that earned income than people who are sitting on their backsides watching their money grow, watching their money make more money. Because we tax capital gains and inheritances and unearned income at a lower rate than we tax earned wages. And we asked the governor to address that as well, so that we reward work rather than rewarding unearned income or taxing unearned income less. The third thing that we asked the governor to do is promote wellness, and particularly by dealing with that issue of health insecurity. And that means to really push hard to get Wisconsin to accept available federal funds for Medicaid expansion. What was made available to our state was looking like it would make our version of Medicaid, which is known as BadgerCare, available to about 93,000 more people if we took the federal funds. And I'm sure you've all heard that Wisconsin is one of only 12 states in the country that continues to refuse to take available federal funding to expand our Medicaid program. We call it BadgerCare here. We could have taken money from the federal government that was available for years to expand BadgerCare and ensure about 93,000 more people. Well, now with the pandemic-related legislation, even more federal Medicaid expansion money is being made available to our state. It's been put on the table, offered to us, that now would bring it up to about 120,000 more people could be insured if we would just take the doggone money. But as you probably have heard, Republicans in the legislature have steadfastly refused to take that money. And so we've been urging the governor to make this a really big priority. Fourth thing we've underlined was wiring Wisconsin. And that's broadband expansion, making high-speed internet available, whether it's in inner city neighborhoods that are dead zones or whether it's out in rural parts of our state that can't get a decent internet connection. Invest in universal broadband in our state. Fifth thing that we encouraged the governor to do was to do what we can at the state level to wean Wisconsin from reliance on fossil fuels, to invest in green energy development, to push hard for a renewable energy future and a renewable energy economy. And one of the points we made to the governor is that this is good economic development strategy. If you invest in renewable energy, it's good economic development strategy because renewable energy companies are creating jobs at 12 times the rate of the rest of our economy. We're producing 12 times more new jobs than other sectors of our economy. So that's something that we really emphasized. And then we encouraged him to propose legalizing marijuana, which not only addresses that social and racial injustice and the mass incarceration problem, because we are locking up so many people for nonviolent offenses, but it also would generate new revenue, close to $200 million a year that could be invested in areas that are really important for our state's future. So we made those 6 suggestions. I'm happy to tell you that the governor touched on all 6 of these areas in his proposed budget. He made proposals that he didn't ignore any of these areas. And he did, not surprisingly, because he's former state school superintendent, he really did emphasize funding for education. He proposed a $1.6 billion increase in funding for K-12 schools, and basically split that, about a little over $613 million in general aid to school districts, but a big proposed increase for special education services for kids with various kinds of disabilities, over $700 million in special ed funding. School districts currently get only 28% of their special ed costs reimbursed. The governor's proposal would take it all the way up to 50%. Now, we should be fully reimbursing school systems for their special ed expenses, but the state is barely picking up a quarter of the cost. He's trying to get it up to 50%. So he did also put $200 million in extra funding for broadband expansion in his budget. So he does address the issue of internet access. He did propose accepting all of the federal Medicaid expansion money, and it's $1.6 billion now that the state could get if we simply have the good sense to take the money. And as I mentioned, that would ensure 120,000 more people in our state than are currently having access to health insurance. So that's a way to really address that health insecurity issue. He does propose legalizing marijuana, not just medical marijuana, but marijuana for personal use as well. His plan generates about $165 million a year in new revenue because it's not only legalized, but also would be taxed. The legal sales of marijuana would be taxed under the governor's proposal. He does address climate action, maybe not as ambitiously as we were pushing him to, or that many have suggested, but he put $100 million in extra money in the budget for energy conservation and renewable energy development, plus about a little over $100 million for borrowing for clean energy and conservation projects. And then put, a number of other initiatives in there, including some climate action goals for the state, and things like about $30 million for help to communities dealing with climate-related problems like flooding and other damages. So he's trying to address that. He does propose in his budget raising the minimum wage, first from $7.25 an hour up to $8.60 an hour, and then up to $9.40 an hour by 2023, and up to $10.15 an hour by 2024. We encouraged him to raise the wage to $15 an hour. And we continue to advocate for a $15 an hour minimum wage. He didn't go that far, but he did put a proposal in there. And I think just as importantly, when it comes to economic inequality, he did put proposals in the budget for tax changes. He would raise about $350 million a year by scaling back the exemptions or the exclusions for capital gains. So capital gains would be taxed about $350 million more under his proposal over the next 2 years. And then there's something called the MAC credit. And it's technically MAC stands for Manufacturing and Agriculture Tax Credit, but I always call it the MAC credit because I always say that this is a loophole big enough to drive a Mack truck through. And it is not about helping manufacturers or farmers. It is a tax credit that puts money in the pockets of multimillionaires, some of the richest people in our state. And so it's not going to help manufacturing companies or farm businesses. It's going in the pockets of very, very wealthy individuals. And he does scale that back and raises about $450 million that way. So those are positive steps. And on top of that, he includes a partial repeal of Act 10 on collective bargaining for public employees. He requires the legislature to consider the so-called people's maps that this commission that he appointed is developing for redistricting, and proposes automatic voter registration. So there's a lot of good stuff that he's put in his budget proposal, but the legislative leaders have made it very clear that they basically consider that proposal dead on arrival in the legislature. They referred to it as a liberal wish list or a liberal fantasy. And they said, we're going to start over, we're going to throw the whole thing out and we're going to start from scratch and we're going to write our own budget. We're not going to work off the governor's proposal. Well, first of all, one of the things I would say is that this is not a liberal wish list. This is well over 2/3 of the people in this state favor taking that federal funding and making healthcare available to more people. It's not Democrats. It's also independents and many Republican voters who support Medicaid expansion. Nearly as many people, nearly as large percentages of the public favor things like marijuana legalization and increasing the minimum wage. So these are Wisconsin's wishes. They're not a liberal wish list. And I think we all need to push back and push back hard against that kind of rhetoric that has been thrown out there to try to convince people that this is not what the people of Wisconsin want. It's just what a few liberals want, and that couldn't be further from the truth. But they are prepared to start from scratch, and that's what leads me to really the two things that I wanted to end my remarks with, things that I wanted to bring to your attention, and then we can throw this open and make it a two-way conversation and questions and comments. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention two things. If the legislature does what they appear to be poised to do and dig in their heels and refuse to take Medicaid expansion money and refuse to embrace these other proposed changes in the budget, the governor's ability to get much of any of what he's proposing really hinges on his use of his veto authority. And the legislature, of course, is very well aware of the governor's veto authority. So they try to write the budget to make it veto proof. They try to write the budget in a way that doesn't expose it to gubernatorial vetoes. And I think that's where what we've tried to urge the governor to do is really act proactively when it comes to his veto authority. When you think about the veto authority, you think about it as being reactive. The legislature takes a step, sends it to the governor, and the governor reacts by saying, I'm going to veto part or all of what you just sent me. What I think we need to be in the governor's ear about is the importance of him using his veto authority proactively to make it very clear to those lawmakers that if he doesn't get some of the things that he has proposed, that he is willing and able to use his veto authority to eliminate some of the things that they have put in the budget and that they want dearly. He's got to be able to identify Republican priorities and be willing to zero them out. And he's got to make it clear to them up front that is exactly what he's going to do. He, in every place where he can, he needs to say, I'll take those pet programs of yours and I'll shrink them to zero, unless you're willing to meet me halfway and cooperate and give me some of what I've proposed. He didn't do much of that 2 years ago. He, I think he had a faith that he could work on a bipartisan basis with legislators. I think he had a belief that they could bargain in good faith, and so you might have noticed that 2 years ago he also proposed taking that federal money for BadgerCare expansion, and the legislature said nuts to that. We're not going to take it, and we didn't ultimately have a budget that accepted those federal funds, and so BadgerCare was not expanded. So many of the other initiatives that were put forward were deep sixed by the legislature, and he can't veto them back into existence. He can take away things that the legislature does, but he can't veto things into existence. And so he would, that's where we've said what we're telling people is that we feel like the governor needs to be more proactive in his use of veto authority and use it strategically and let them know very clearly up front that they will pay a price if they don't work with him on some of these things like BadgerCare expansion. If we don't get these things, then they'll also stand to lose things. And he's got to identify those things that he'll take away. So The other thing that leads me to the last point that I'd like to share with you before we open it up for discussion. And it's a very little known aspect of the state budgeting practices, but it plays a huge role and it looms large. Most people don't know that Republicans like to talk a lot about how they are tight-fisted and how they're fiscally conservative and how they really work to keep the budget down and taxes low and all of that. But what people don't know is that those lawmakers also effectively sign blank checks for many programs and many spending areas in the state of Wisconsin, where basically they sign the check and then the amount is filled in later. And whatever it takes to fund those programs is what ends up being authorized. So the legislature is literally signing blank checks when it adopts budgets. Though in budget speak, those are called sum sufficient appropriations. There are basically two kinds of budget spending. There are what are called sum certain appropriations, and as the name implies, those are fixed amounts. They write into the budget, here's how much we're going to spend on this particular program or this particular area of the budget. And it's a sum certain, can't be more than that. And then there are about 200 sum sufficient appropriations. Now, I'm not making that up, 200 sum sufficient appropriations where they write in a number, but it's basically a fictitious number because it can be any amount. Whatever needs to be spent will be spent. They are effectively signing a blank check. Those sum sufficient appropriations really fall under three categories. One of them is for debt repayment. And there's a whole bunch of these sprinkled throughout the budget to repay various state debt. So basically, whatever the state owes, the state pays. Now, that makes some sense, right? We need to make good on our debts, and so if whatever we end up owing on that debt, we need to pay. The second major category is for the operation of the legislature, the governor's office, and the courts. You heard me right. The legislature does not make itself live within a fixed budget. It signs a blank check for its operations. Whatever they want to spend, they can spend. And that's not known by very many people. Now, most people don't know that there is a blank check for the operations of the legislature, but there is. Third major category are what are popularly called entitlement programs. And there's all kinds of different programs that qualify as entitlements. And basically, if this amount of spending ends up depending on how many people end up qualifying for those benefits or for that public assistance. Now, most people, when they think of entitlements, they've been trained to think about welfare programs. That's what they think an entitlement is, or on the national level, they think about Social Security. Not too many people know this, but one of the Republicans' very favorite entitlement programs, and there is a sum sufficient appropriation for this, a blank check is signed for this, and that's private school vouchers. The money that can be siphoned away from public schools and given to people in the form of vouchers to pay for private schooling, there is a sum sufficient appropriation in the budget for that. And one of the things that I want you all to be aware of is that not only are these blank checks a reflection of what the Republicans really want to spend money on, and they don't want any limit on that spending. They want as much to go there as is needed. But it's also one of the ways that they try to thwart the governor's veto authority or get around the governor's veto authority. Because the governor could, with a sum sufficient appropriation, he can't veto that he can take that number and veto it to zero, but the blank check has still been signed. And whoever qualifies for vouchers can get vouchers. So unless you repeal the voucher law altogether, the amount of money available is limitless. And most people don't know that. There's not a fixed budget for private school vouchers. And part of the reason why is that that's one of the ways they try to keep it out of the governor's reach. And so that's where we had encouraged the governor to take a very aggressive stance and actually propose eliminating private school vouchers altogether. He didn't do that 2 years ago, and he didn't do that this time, even though the governor did promise during his campaign to phase out school vouchers. He hasn't proposed phasing them out in either of his budgets. He also, by the way, did promise to close down the state's corporate welfare office, what's known as the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. During the campaign, he pledged to eliminate the WEDC. He hasn't proposed that either place, but that is actually one of the areas where there is a fixed budget and where the governor could strategically say, look, if you're not willing to cooperate with me on things like BadgerCare expansion or some of these other areas or climate action, or pick your pet issue, if you're not willing to cooperate with me, I'm prepared to eliminate funding for this thing that you've really made a priority for all these years. That's the kind of strategic use of his veto authority that could give him the kind of leverage needed to extract some concessions from a very belligerent legislature. But I wanted to bring up that issue of the blank checks that are signed, those some sufficient appropriations in budget terminology, and the role that they play in all of this. And I think Republicans should be taken to task for this. They're constantly saying that they are such great stewards of public funds, and they're such budget hawks, and they want less spending and lower taxes. And yet they sign 200 blank checks a year for various state spending, including their own operations in the legislature. And they're not living within fixed budgets as families have to. So with all of that having been said, let me stop there. And I hope that's been useful information and some insights into what's going on with the budget and where some opportunities might exist. But from this point forward, I'll let you all guide the discussion. Whatever you want to talk about or are interested in, feel free to chime in, ask questions, make comments, however you want to handle this. So I'll throw it back to Chuck for now. But thank you for giving me the chance to share some of these thoughts. And I did put a couple of links in there to give some more information on these topics. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. This would be the point at which we all clap again. Yeah, good presentation. And boy, that's
just not the same over Zoom.
Yeah, not the same, but yeah, no, powerful presentation. I know I learned a lot about the confusing budget process such as it is, and I'm not sure I followed everything. Like, can or cannot the governor actually veto the private school voucher stuff?
That's actually a question that I've been asking the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, and I've been exploring this topic with them, and the answer I've gotten in recent days from the Fiscal Bureau is that he can veto the funding, but that it doesn't have any effect if he does, because still the underlying appropriation is what's known as a sum sufficient. Whatever is needed to pay for those vouchers, the state is obligated to pay. So that's where the governor, I think, would really need to challenge the legislature and say, this kind of stuff should be it should have a fixed budget. And he needs to be willing to go out and say, look, there should be a fixed number for this spending, and we should, we can negotiate on what that number would be. But if you're not willing to negotiate with me, I would veto the whole thing. So in essence, he can exercise his veto authority there, but it would, according to the Fiscal Bureau, be a largely symbolic act as long as the appropriation remains a sum sufficient one.
Tricky. Okay,
Yeah.
Ida asked, is there a way to get rid of the blank check policy?
Only if enough people are made aware of the blank check policy and are willing to insist that it be done away with to the greatest extent possible. And I think legislators really count on nobody knowing about it and nobody calling them on it, including the governor. And as a result, they just sort of quietly budget this way, and they don't ever pay a price for it. And so I actually wrote an op-ed, the Gazette published it, about these sum sufficient appropriations, just trying to raise awareness of it. But this is it. There's nothing in state law that prohibits this behavior. It is a long-standing budget practice, and it will only be stopped or curtailed if enough people demand that it be stopped or at least curtailed somewhat.
Okay, David, I see David raising his hand.
Yeah, I have two related questions. Why couldn't the governor, instead of vetoing a total, put in a specific sum? Say, I'll go along with X million dollars, small, relatively small amount, and turn it into a specific amount rather than just trying to totally veto it.
Well, the governor is limited in terms of what he can write into the final budget. He could have proposed making school vouchers a some certain appropriation. He didn't do that with his budget request. He could have done that, and I would argue he should have done that. He could now try to insist that it become a some certain and that it become a fixed budget. He has so far not chosen to do that.
Okay.
My concern is that if he doesn't take on some of these issues with the budget, he won't have very much leverage when it comes to getting the legislature to grant him some of his wishes. They're just going to strip out all of his proposals and then pass their own budget, and then he can use his veto authority on much of that, not all of it, but much of it, that they don't conceal from his reach. But one of the interesting things would be to explore whether there would be a way through exercising a partial veto where he could seek to turn a sum sufficient into a sum certain. I don't think that without that language being explicitly spelled out in the budget bill, I don't think he could get at it. But
I think it'd be interesting to check that alternative out a little bit more. My only other related question is to what extent has this funding, the use of funds for vouchers been growing or not been growing in recent years?
It's been steadily growing, David. And, of course, the voucher program is about 30 years old now, and it started out only in Milwaukee. And at the beginning, it was pitched as a program that was only for low-income families in Milwaukee. Eventually, they expanded it to places like Racine and Beloit and Green Bay. And then they also further expanded it by raising the income eligibility threshold. So it wasn't just for low-income families, it could be for even middle-income families. And then, of course, they expanded it statewide and said that people could get vouchers anywhere in the state. So it's been steadily expanding. And of course, as a result, the cost has also been steadily growing. And what that has done is it has eroded the public school aid, the money for vouchers has been taken out of the hides of public school students and their teachers. It's been money taken away from the budgets of public schools across our state. And what you see is the percentage of local school budgets paid for with state aid steadily declining. The local schools have been made more and more heavily dependent on local property taxes. And of course, local property taxpayers in many of the communities across the state are, those, especially in rural areas, those economies are struggling. Taxpayers are feeling really stressed, and they won't pass referendums in those communities to provide adequate funding for their local schools. And so those local schools have just had to cannibalize their budgets. And a part of the problem is that so much money is being siphoned away from public schools to go to the private school vouchers instead. And the promise 30 years ago was that vouchers were going to improve student performance. They were going to increase test scores. They were going to drive school improvement, and none of that has happened. 30 years later, voucher students don't do any better than their counterparts in public schools, and by a few measures, they actually do worse. So it hasn't created the growth in student achievement that was promised. I've always made the argument that if a program works, fund it, but if a program doesn't work, get rid of it. This program has been around for 30 years and it hasn't delivered the promised results, and yet more and more and more money is being funneled into this program. The Republicans love it. And I really think the public needs to pressure the governor to be much more assertive in challenging the voucher program. He promised to phase it out when he was a candidate. He hasn't proposed that in either of his budgets. But now, as I've said, I'd love to hear the governor come out now and say, hey, does anybody realize that this is a blank check that's been written for these vouchers, and that there's no limit, there's no fixed budget for it, there's no limit on how much can go to vouchers, and really try to shame the legislature into changing that particular policy. Get it to a sum certain that he actually could use his partial veto authority on.
It's outrageous. Ed asks, the state parks seem to be running too lean. I don't see many rangers anymore. Any proposals for parks and for DNR increases in funding?
Yeah, the governor does put in his budget some proposals for increased funding for parks and generally for DNR operations. Whether the legislature will go along with any of that is another question. And so there again is an area where the governor can propose, but the legislature so far has said, we're just going to throw his proposal or his request in the garbage can, and we're going to start with a clean slate and write our own budget. If that's what the Joint Finance Committee ends up doing, and the two houses then approve that, the budget that will be sent back to the governor, my guess is that he won't get $1.6 billion in new money for public schools. They'll cut that significantly, but there will probably be some new money for schools. I would say that the other likely place where there might be agreement will be broadband. He asks for $200 million in extra money for internet expansion. He might get something close to that, but unless lawmakers overrule people like Robin Vos, the leaders of the legislature, who are saying they're not going to take the federal funding for Medicaid expansion, that $1.6 billion that is on the table there for the taking in Wisconsin would be sent back to Washington. And the governor can't use his veto to create that he can. That's a great example of where he would need to say, look, if you don't take the $1.6 billion for Medicaid expansion, here are the things you're going to lose that you've put in the budget. And you can think these things are great, but they're not going to happen. They're all going to disappear if we don't get something like Medicaid expansion. And I think to get significant movement on parks or conservation programs, and he has put more money in for the stewardship fund and all those kinds of things. But to get it from the legislature, I think he's going to have to play some hardball with those lawmakers.
Right. Margaret has her hand up. Maggie?
Yeah. So do the Republicans really believe that it's not in the best interest of Wisconsin to take the Medicaid money, or is this a game we're playing?
You know, that's a really good question, and I can't look into their hearts and know for sure. But what they say doesn't make any sense, but what they say is that if we took that money, that eventually what the federal government right now is saying is that we will fully fund the expansion of BadgerCare, will fully fund that insurance for 120,000 more people. What the Republicans say is, well, you know, they'll eventually say, well, we're only going to pay 90% of the cost, or we're only going to pay 50% of the cost, and the state will be left to pick up the rest of the bill. And so in the future, down the road, it might be a significant cost to the state. Now, what's been happening with federal Medicaid expansion has been the exact opposite. The federal government used to say, we'll pay 90% of the cost, and you pick up 10%, but we'll, you know, if you want to expand Medicaid to more people in your state, the federal government will pay 90% of the bill. Eventually, the federal government said, we'll pay 100%. And then they said, we'll pay 100% for even more people. and now it's up to the point where it's $1.6 billion that the state of Wisconsin could get for the next 2 years to insure 120,000 people, and it would be 100% funded by the federal government. But the legislators are saying, well, but you know, that they might reverse course in the future and not provide us full funding. Now, for me, my argument would be, well, the state wouldn't be obligated to continue to provide that insurance then. You know, they wouldn't have to have all those people eligible if the money got pulled back. So it doesn't make a lot of sense what their argument is. But the other thing I hear is that a lot of them seem to say they regard it as welfare, and they just don't want to support insuring people in a program that they consider a welfare program. And you know, tell you know, a small dairy farmer that only has health insurance because of BadgerCare that's a welfare program. I mean, that's a lifeline for them. But that's the other rhetoric that you hear is sort of an anti-welfare kind of argument. But having said all of that, I think it's just a game. I think it's just this kind of maddening political dysfunction. And it doesn't make common sense. Why? Here's the thing. If we don't take the money, we end up, all of us state taxpayers will actually pay more to insure fewer people. We'll insure fewer people than if we took the money, and we will also pay higher state taxes to insure the fewer number that we will actually be insuring under BadgerCare. That makes absolutely no sense, to insure fewer people and pay higher state taxes to do it. But that would be the outcome of that policy. But you saw recently where the mask mandate, which has become so politicized, you know, the legislature rejected it, then got the Republican-controlled Supreme Court to strike it down, and that put at risk something like $70 million in food assistance from the federal government. And now a deal has been struck with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and apparently we're going to get that food aid after all. The administration has worked out some kind of an arrangement, but the legislature and the Supreme Court's action was basically saying, keep the money. We don't want that food assistance. And that, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in Wisconsin.
Doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it?
I just want to interject something here. I was kind of hoping to end relatively soon, where people get a little zoomed out after an hour. Maybe we go a few minutes over, but keep that in mind. Norm had his hand up.
Yeah, I think that was really some good information about how much money we spend on prisons as opposed to the university system. And I think there's a letter to the editor there somewhere that I'm going to have to start working on. Another thing, though, is Robin Voss. So many things that you've talked about, minimum wage, even legalization of marijuana, are things that the people of Wisconsin want. Do you think it's time that we really need to storm the Bastille?
You know, I think it's long past time to storm the Bastille, but, you know, keep in mind that in 2011, you had 100,000 people protesting at the Capitol, and then a million people who signed recall petitions following up those weeks of historic protests. And the governor at the time and his allies in the legislature just went ahead and did exactly what they planned on doing and rammed it through. So they've proven to be remarkably insensitive to public opinion or the will of the people. But that's not unique to Robin Voss and state legislative Republicans. I mean, nationally, Republicans are catering to their base and to their big donors, and are refusing to act on issues where there is very broad public support. And you mentioned a couple of them. Super majorities support things like raising the minimum wage and taking Medicaid expansion money to expand healthcare access. Legalizing marijuana has strong majorities in favor, and they just are unwilling to do it anyway, and have proven remarkably resistant to public pressure.
Apropos of that, I wanted to ask two questions. One is rhetorical. I just don't understand why Evers doesn't play more hardball, why he's even trying to follow up on his campaign promises and step in. And the second question is there something specific that you can give us? I mean, I assume writing letters to Evers is obviously one of the things. Do you have templates for that? What specifically can we try to do now? Because the Republicans seem impervious. It seems like we need to do what you suggested, which is put pressure on Evers. And what specifically can we do?
Well, you know, I think if you just zero in on that idea of using his veto authority preemptively or proactively, strategically, kind of laying out for lawmakers, here's what's going to happen if I don't get some cooperation, rather than just waiting until they drop a bill on his desk and he tries to deal with it around the kind of the margins or try to, you know, put lipstick on that pig. To use it more as a negotiating tool rather than as just a reactive device that he can use at the end of the process, and you know, challenge him to really get aggressive on some of these areas where the Republicans really want to spend money. And challenge them on these things like the blank checks that are written, those so-called sum sufficient appropriations for things like school vouchers. The governor's taken a relatively conciliatory approach with the legislature. I think after, you know, this is the second go around with the budget, and after the first go around, and just the way that they repeatedly tried to strip him of his powers, I'm not sure why he believes that they really are open to working with him. So, you know, I think he just needs more people on his own side saying, no, we need you to employ a very different strategy this time. We need a more aggressive approach than in the last budget, or else we're going to go through another budget cycle and we're going to forego 1.6 billion in Medicaid expansion funds, unless we get some much more forceful leadership from the governor's office, because the one glimmer of hope was Howard Markline, who's a finance committee member, sort of said that he was open to at least considering the Medicaid expansion money. But then like a day or two later, Robin Voss said, that's a non-starter. We're not doing that. And so I think to get it, we're going to have the people really clamoring for it, but then we're also going to need the governor to capitalize on that public sentiment and really push for it.
Well, if you or somebody wants to put out letters, because I mean, the budget stuff is so complicated. So I know if I had a letter to work with that had some of this stuff spelled out, and then you put it in your own words and, call and write, I know that a lot more people might be likely to do it. I want to encourage people to go to OWR, get involved in that. It's a great organization. And people have tried to take the bull by the horns in Rock County and try to get something around here, and it's been a real struggle. So now it's your turn, you folks out there, whoever's energy and time and wants to do that.
Ashley Hudson is our Southwest region organizer, and she is on the call tonight, and she did drop her email in the chat box. And so if there's anybody who wants to reach out about joining forces with us and getting involved with OWR, just drop Ashley a note at some point, and you can always check out our website, but feel free to also just drop Ashley a line about getting involved, and feel free to email me as well. I will put my email in the chat box as well.
Yeah, and I don't.
Did my sound go bad all of a sudden?
Well, throughout the evening, your sound has been coming in and out. I don't know whether it's you or something in the Zoom process, but I have noticed that happening.
Sorry about that.
I was going to mention it afterward because not much you can do. But yeah, there's Mike's email up there if you want to contact him, get involved. And I don't know what else we can do creatively. We could have, a car protest around Madison. I don't know, drive our cars around the block or something. If someone wants to get creative and besides letter writing, it's this challenge Zoom organizing protests are, but do what we can.
Yep.
Along with the budget, voter suppression is really on my mind too, because I think the Republicans really saw that we had some power in voting and getting our vote out there, and they're going to the next step. They're ahead of us right now. They're looking to try to suppress the vote, and so I contacted legislators today and to try to let them know what I feel about it. And I think I don't know. I mean, I'm not a politician. I don't work in politics. I don't know how that works. But what Janet said too in her chat about, this thing about the unlimited thing with vouchers, I had no idea that was there. So I learned something tonight that I found. I mean, I never supported vouchers, but I had no idea that it was an unlimited check.
You're not alone. Very, very few people know that. And it's why I really appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you tonight. Just to bring up something like that. I know it's wonky budget stuff and it's insider stuff, but it has such a huge impact on our public schools, and it has such a huge impact on all of us as taxpayers when they engage in these practices.
But teachers have the time to go through the budget to figure out where their money is going.
That's right. And the budget doesn't, if you read it, who actually sits down and reads a several 100-page budget document? But if you do read it, there would be no clue that you would be given about the fact that one appropriation is some sufficient and another is some certain. There's some letter codes that are there, but it's really an insider. It's an insider practice, and I've just been in touch with the nonpartisan budget office, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, and been asking for answers from them, and then I share what I know. But But very few people know about this, but it ends up affecting a lot of people, and it affects them very adversely, and it certainly adversely affects our public schools.
Yeah, there is a Fair Maps Coalition, as somebody mentioned, and I mean, I get their emails, and they're out there. Get in touch with them if someone wants to get active around that. And somebody mentioned also recently there were hearings around the Medicaid expansion. I believe that's what it was, out in Whitewater, which we also publicized. I wasn't able to make it, unfortunately, but I heard a hearty band of such did go out there, and including somebody who I'm hoping will write up an article on it, and we might get that out there. But I don't know if there are going to be more hearings. Have you heard anything about future hearings on such stuff? I guess if you had, you'll spread the word, right?
Yeah, you know, and I think if there are groups that are continuing to hold forums and such, the legislature is pretty much winding up its hearings, and will start its deliberations in the finance committee of actually marking up a budget and writing a proposal. And so it's starting to get into the nitty gritty. But during that process, people have got to be in their ear about these things, and in the governor's ear.
So this is timely. Folks got to get on the horn, get your pens handy or your typewriters or whatever, the computers, and get the word out, because we got to let beavers hear us. And again, Mike, that was, I think, a really great presentation, very informative on a tough subject over Zoom. That's a no small feat. So thanks much. I will be putting up this video for folks to watch and spread it around. We'll put it on Facebook and YouTube and such. So once again, thanks much. And
thank you, Chuck. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Really good.
well,
Interesting. Wow.
Thank you.
I'm going to end it now. Bye-bye.